Well, the ESEA flexibility waiver does exactly what the name implies, and that is it does offer a bit of a waiver for some components of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, specifically the components that were included in No Child Left Behind and the NCLB component. There are a number of components that are waived, but they all really tie into one area, which would be the ineffectual identification of school buildings. And so essentially what they have done is they've allowed states to bring forward ambitious yet attainable AMOs to more effectively identify buildings, and then no longer requiring states to make adequate yearly progress determinations. So we're doing away with AYP reports and determinations based upon adequate yearly progress, and we're looking more at the attainment of specific goals to our state targets. So what that does, absent school identification based upon, what they were doing was labeling schools as failing if a school district or building did not meet those adequate yearly progress targets for 2 consecutive years in the same content area. Doing away with school identification as a failing school means that we're also doing away with those sanctions that were applied to that identification. So for example, school districts were required to set aside 20% of their Title I funding to support specific interventions. And the U.S. Department of Education has come forward and said this is a local decision now. Local districts know best what interventions are needed. So supplemental educational services, for example, may be one area a district would like to choose, but they would no longer be required to do so. They would not be required to offer public school choice within districts unless they felt that was something they would like to do. Professional development is left to the discretion of the local district. That is something that is obviously something most districts would find very important and would want to do, but they're letting the districts decide what is best for the school improvement efforts in their school. So to sum it up, it's really moving from sanctions to supports and a better use of resources and leaving that discretion more to the local level. Annual measurable objectives have been in place since the beginning of No Child Left Behind, but what has changed is with the inception of No Child Left Behind in 2001, the expected proficiency was 100% proficient by the year 2014. So those annual measurable objectives were set on a trajectory towards 100% proficiency by 2014, and all subgroups, all groups of total needed to meet that proficiency target every year. What the waiver has allowed, or the flexibility has allowed, is for states to bring forward their plans on ambitious yet attainable AMOs for their state. And so what Missouri has done is it's taken the top 10 by 20 plan, and we've looked at where we need to be as a state if we'd like to be competitive with all states by the year 2020. If we want to be in the top 10 by 20, what kind of a proficiency rate would we need as a state? And we have projected our trajectory based upon where we are now and what it will take to get us to be the top 10 by 20 in English language arts and mathematics and in our graduation rate. We've also set a separate trajectory for our student gap group that we'll be talking about in a little bit, and that target was established to cut the achievement gap in half by the year 2020. So we see these as both ambitious but attainable goals. The other difference is that the annual measurable objectives under the flexibility component are intended to be used for school buildings and districts to inform their improvement plans, to set targets, to set goals for their improvement plans, not to label the building as failing. These are about, again, movement from sanctions to supports. It's a continuous improvement model. How are we going to put the right pieces in place to get there? The student gap group is a way of better utilizing the traditional subgroups that we've used in our state. And so with the inception of NCLB, one of the components of that was to make sure that we were paying attention to the performance of every child, of each child, particularly those who may have special needs. So for example, we have broken out the data into 10 subgroups, and we've looked at 6 race and ethnicity groups, students with free and reduced price lunch, students, English language learners, and students with individual educational plans, IEPs. And then we also looked at our group of total and to determine how our buildings were performing, and looked at the percent proficient on the state assessments for those groups. Most in Missouri, do you want me to stop? Most have embraced the concept of looking at subgroup data and paying attention. It has certainly served our children well to be paying attention to every child and to every subgroup and how they are performing. But there were some challenges in the implementation of NCLB, and a couple of those examples are a student, we had a duplicated count. For example, one student might be Hispanic, an English language learner, free and reduced priced lunch, and had an IEP. And that student might have counted 4 times in the district when it was really just one score that was being used. That was one complication with the current implementation of NCLB. We also had some other issues in implementation in our state. Our state is very diverse in Missouri. So in order to count a subgroup, you needed a minimum size of 30 students if you were going to hold the district accountable. So in some cases, we might have a district that had or a building that had 14 subgroups. In some of our smaller districts, they may only have 4. And so there were just a couple of changes like that. So when we came to looking at how we would best want to really work on an accountability system that would continue to validate and to pay attention to every child and every subgroup, and also for accountability purposes, do this in a little more of a fair manner, or a more meaningful manner, I should say. We ran the data as a state, and we looked at those subgroups that were performing significantly below the state total. Those subgroups that were performing significantly below the state level were Black, Hispanic, English language learners, students on free and reduced price lunch, and our English language learners. Or did I say that already? IEP, ELL, free and reduced price lunch, and Black and Hispanic students. So those 5 subgroups have been combined into a student gap group. And what we're going to do is, for reporting purposes, is to continue to report at all of the traditional levels. We think it's really important to continue to maintain those groups, and for reporting purposes, help inform instruction, help inform what's happening at the local level on those subgroups. But when we're looking at accountability determinations, we're going to look at those 5 subgroups that I just mentioned into one subgroup. Therefore, the student I mentioned earlier who might be counted 4 times in a district, that score would only be counted once for accountability determinations. That helps us make sure that we've gone to 100% of our districts will have a subgroup, 98% of our buildings will have a subgroup, and it also helps for every child to be included in that subgroup who would be recognized in one of those categories, regardless of N size, regardless of meeting that 30. So in our previous situation, we might have, in a really small school, a student who might have gone through the entire system without ever being held, the district may not be held accountable for that subgroup because of the minimum size. So we think that this is a much better situation for reporting purposes, again, paying attention to every subgroup, for accountability purposes, looking at in its total. Okay, reward schools, that's a new category for the U.S. Department of Education, and basically what we're looking at there are our highest performing, or our buildings who are showing the greatest amount of improvement. And we look at 3 years of data in both mathematics and English language arts, and we also look at graduation rate. And again, they would be noticed as our highest performers or our most improved. Priority schools are among our lowest performing Title I schools in the state. So we'll be looking at, again, 3 years of data for mathematics and English language arts, and looking at the lowest percent proficient in both of those categories, as well as the lowest graduation rates, below 60% graduation rate for the last 3 years. And so those become really the priority for the state. They're the 5% of the lowest. There are 57 buildings that will be identified as priority. And the interventions that will take place there will align to the turnaround principles. that if you may have heard about and through some of the school improvement grant processes. But in this case, it's really a focus on classroom instructional practice. How are we going to engage the students? We're going to look at the rigor. We're going to look at instructional practice significantly in those buildings. There is a requirement to look at what's happening at the leadership level. There's not a requirement to replace the principal, but there is a requirement to observe what's happening at the leadership and at the teacher level. Who's impacting instruction? Is it working? How do they know? What changes need to be made, and so forth. Focus schools are among the 10% of our lowest performing student gap groups. So when we talked about the student gap group and that identification, what we're looking at here is the lowest percent proficient over the last 3 years of that student gap group, which again is Black, Hispanic, ELL, students with IEPs, and our free and reduced price lunch. And ELL stands for English Language Learners. I have to stop using my acronyms. So we look at that, and then the interventions that would be applied for the focus schools are similar to those for the priority, where we'd be looking, again, a real focus on instructional practice, but it'll be much more focused in that area of which student population really needs the greatest intervention and how can we help move that performance forward. Again, you'll probably see a lot of work around differentiated instruction. We know all kids learn differently, and so how do we reach all kids? For the first time, we will be recognizing reward schools. And so that is something I believe the U.S. Department of Education heard loudly and clearly, that this should not just be about sanctions, this should not just be about labeling schools as failing, but really recognizing those buildings and districts who should serve as models of excellence throughout the state. So we will be identifying 102 buildings as recognizing them for high performance. And then when we move to looking at one of the key things we're talking about was that ineffectual identification of buildings as failing. The priority building list will have 57, and in the focus we'll have 115. That's a big switch from the 872 buildings who were not meeting AYP on the old system. And we don't have the numbers right now to tell you what it would have looked like for 2012, but we do believe that this reduced number of buildings identified as priority and focused will really be a better use of our resources, and would be a better use of really have much greater impact than spreading those resources so thin throughout the state by over-identifying schools in need of improvement. As a part of the waiver, one of the components that you'll see throughout is a real movement from simply looking at the credentials of a teacher, the highly qualified teacher, and looking at really impact, looking at the highly effective teacher. And so the educator evaluation system was something that Missourians were already putting into place prior to the waiver opportunity. We know that if we're going to talk about improved instructional practice, it's going to start with the teachers, the principals, the superintendents, and so forth. So how do we know that teachers are making a difference? How do we know superintendents are making a difference? How do we know principals are making a difference in our buildings? And I think probably the key part to the educator evaluation system is a little too complex to go into in great detail here right now. But it is all on the website if anybody would like to read in detail how that system really works. But if there are a couple of things I'd really like to pull out of that, it's that one, Missouri educators have been working on this for quite some time. It's something that Missouri has put together, and again, great thanks to the educators who have stepped up to say we want to do better and we want to be better, and how can we make this a better system. And two, the system is designed as a formative tool. It's about improving instruction in the classroom.